December 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The temperature had dropped to -15 degrees Celsius, and the 101st Airborne Division was completely surrounded by German forces in what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Ammunition was running critically low. Every rifle round had to count. Supply drops were being shot down before they could reach American lines. And in the middle of this frozen hell, a 23-year-old private from rural Kentucky named Jack "Rabbit" Thornton was sitting in a foxhole, crafting something out of surgical tubing and scrap that would make his entire battalion think he'd completely lost his mind. He called it his Liberator. Everyone else called it a slingshot, and they laughed hard. Now, to understand why Jack's fellow soldiers thought this was the stupidest thing they'd ever seen, you need to understand what they were up against. The German forces had them outnumbered 3-1. They had panzer tanks. They had artillery. They had machine gun nests set up every 200 meters along the tree line. And the Americans? They were down to less than 50 rounds per man. Some soldiers were sharing rifles. Into this desperate situation, Jack Thornton emerged from his foxhole carrying what looked like a child's toy, a Y-shaped piece of oak branch, surgical rubber tubing he'd salvaged from a destroyed medic station, and a leather pouch cut from his own boot. His squad leader, Sergeant Frank Morrison, took one look at it and said, "Thornton, are you planning to fight the Wehrmacht with a goddamn slingshot?" The entire squad erupted in laughter. One soldier, Private Danny Kowalski, laughed so hard he had to lean against the trench wall. "What are you gonna do, Rabbit? Take out a panzer with a pebble?" Even the lieutenant cracked a smile, which in the Ardennes winter was saying something. But Jack didn't laugh. He just looked at Morrison and said 5 words that would echo through military history. "I only need one shot." Now, here's where this story gets interesting, because Jack Thornton wasn't just some random soldier with a death wish. And that slingshot wasn't just a toy. To understand what happened next, you need to know about Harlan County, Kentucky in the 1930s. During the Great Depression, Harlan County was one of the poorest regions in America. The coal mines were barely operational. Families were starving. And if you wanted to eat meat, you had exactly 2 options. You could scrape together money, you didn't have to buy it, or you could hunt it yourself. Jack's family didn't have money, but Jack's grandfather had taught him something that most people had forgotten was even possible. He taught him to hunt with a slingshot, not the cheap metal ones you'd buy at a store. A real hunting slingshot with surgical tubing that could generate over 200 joules of kinetic energy. Enough force to take down a deer at 40 yards. From age 7 until he enlisted at 21, Jack hunted exclusively with a slingshot. Squirrels, rabbits, wild turkeys, deer. He once took down a black bear that was threatening his family's livestock. People in Harlan County called him Rabbit because he never missed. In 14 years of hunting, Jack Thornton had fired over 10,000 shots with a slingshot. His accuracy rate, 98.3%. He could hit a silver dollar at 50 yards. He could strike a moving target the size of a tennis ball at 30 yards. And most importantly, he could do it in complete silence. No muzzle flash. No gunshot report. Nothing that would give away his position. The Wehrmacht had no idea what was coming. On December 22, 1944, the situation in Bastogne became critical. The German forces had established 7 machine gun positions in a semicircle around the American lines. These weren't just random placements. They were strategically positioned to create overlapping fields of fire. Every one of these positions was manned by experienced Wehrmacht soldiers. Every position had multiple shooters. And every position was protected by sandbags, with only small viewing slits for the gunners to see through. The American commanders needed these positions taken out. But here's the problem. They were 800 yards away from American lines. You couldn't get close enough for a grenade. You couldn't use a rifle without immediately drawing fire from the other 6 positions. You couldn't call in artillery because ammunition for the big guns was being saved for tank attacks. And you absolutely could not send a squad to assault them directly because that would be suicide. Colonel Roberts, the battalion commander, called a meeting with his officers. He said, "I need solutions, gentlemen. Because if we don't take out those machine gun nests in the next 72 hours, the Germans are going to punch through our lines and we're all dead." The room went silent. Nobody had an answer. That's when Sergeant Morrison, almost as a joke, said, "Well, sir, Private Thornton thinks he can take them out with a slingshot." The entire room turned to look at him. Colonel Roberts's face went completely blank. He said, "Sergeant, are you suffering from frostbite-induced delirium?" But Morrison, to his credit, stood his ground. He said, "Sir, I know how it sounds, but I watched this kid shoot a tin can off a fence post at 40 yards this morning, with a slingshot, in the dark, and he didn't miss once." The colonel stared at Morrison for a long moment. Then he said, "Get Thornton in here, now." When Jack walked into that command tent, every officer in the room was looking at him like he was a ghost, or an idiot. He was 23 years old, barely weighed 140 pounds soaking wet, and he was holding what looked like a toy weapon. Colonel Roberts didn't waste time with pleasantries. He pointed to a map on the table and said, "Thornton, you see these 7 positions marked here? Sergeant Morrison tells me you think you can neutralize them with a slingshot. Explain to me how that's remotely possible." Jack stepped up to the table. He looked at the map. He looked at the marked positions. And then he started talking, and everyone in that tent realized very quickly that Jack Thornton wasn't an idiot. He was a tactical genius. He said, "Sir, a machine gun nest has 3 vulnerabilities. First, the gunner has to expose his head to aim. Second, the ammunition loader has to be close to the gun to keep it fed. Third, every position needs a commanding officer to coordinate fire. If you eliminate any one of these 3 people, the entire position becomes combat ineffective." He pointed to the first position on the map. "This nest is 45 yards from the tree line. I can get within 30 yards using the drainage ditch that runs parallel to their position. At 30 yards, I have a clean angle on their viewing slit. When the gunner looks out to scan for targets, I have approximately 1.2 seconds to make the shot before he pulls back." Colonel Roberts interrupted. "And you're going to do what exactly?" "Throw a rock at him." Jack reached into his pack and pulled out what he'd been making for the past 3 days. They weren't rocks. They were custom-made steel ball bearings, 3/4 of an inch in diameter, perfectly spherical, each one weighing exactly 28 grams. He'd machined them himself in the remains of a destroyed Belgian factory using a hand file and sandpaper, spending hours making each one perfectly balanced. He set one on the table. It rolled slightly, catching the lamplight. "Sir, when I fire this projectile from my slingshot, it's traveling at approximately 200 feet per second. At that velocity with this mass, it generates roughly 150 foot-pounds of force. That's equivalent to a .38 special round fired from a pistol." The tent went completely silent. Jack continued, "It will penetrate a human skull at ranges up to 40 yards. It produces no muzzle flash, no sound louder than a whisper, and leaves no trace of where it came from. The Germans will have no idea they're under attack until their soldiers start dropping. And because I'm not using a firearm, they won't know which direction to return fire." Captain Hayes, the intelligence officer, leaned forward. "You're telling me you can headshot 7 different machine gunners, from 30 to 40 yards away, in combat conditions without missing?" Jack looked him dead in the eye and said, "Sir, I'm telling you I can do it in 72 hours. 1 position every 10 to 12 hours. And they'll never see me coming. Then he reached into his other pocket and pulled out a small notebook. Inside were pages and pages of hand-drawn diagrams, approach routes, wind calculations, elevation adjustments, timing windows based on German patrol patterns he'd been observing for 6 days. Colonel Roberts picked up one of the steel balls. He turned it over in his hand. Then he looked at Jack and said, "Thornton, if you're lying to me, or if this is some kind of delusion brought on by the cold, I'm going to personally court-martial you for wasting my time." He paused. "But if you can actually do this, if you can take out even half of these positions, you'll save hundreds of American lives." Jack nodded. "I understand, sir. When can you start?" "Tonight, sir. First position goes down at 0300 hours. At 0200 hours on December 23rd, Jack Thornton left the American lines. He was dressed entirely in white, a parachute silk cover over his uniform for camouflage against the snow. He carried no rifle, no grenades, no standard military equipment at all. Just his slingshot, a pouch containing 12 steel ball bearings, a combat knife, and a pair of wire cutters. The temperature was -18 degrees Celsius. The wind was gusting at 15 miles per hour, and he had to cross 600 yards of open ground to reach the drainage ditch that would take him to Position 1. It took him 40 minutes to make that crossing. He moved 3 feet, then stopped for 2 minutes. Another 3 feet. Another stop. Patient. Methodical. Invisible. German flares periodically lit up the night sky, and each time one went up, Jack froze completely, becoming just another snow-covered hump in the landscape. At 0248 hours, he reached the drainage ditch. It was half filled with frozen water, but it provided perfect cover. He crawled through ice water for another 150 yards until he was exactly 32 yards from Position 1. He could hear them talking. 3 German soldiers, one on the MG-42 machine gun, one loading ammunition, one officer standing behind them giving quiet orders. They were relaxed, confident. They had no reason to believe anyone could get this close. Jack settled into position. He braced his left forearm against the frozen embankment. He loaded a steel ball bearing into the leather pouch. He drew the surgical tubing back to full extension 36 inches of draw. His breath came out in small, controlled puffs that immediately froze in the air. At 0303 hours, the gunner leaned forward to scan the American lines through his viewing slit. Jack had exactly 1.2 seconds. He released. The ball bearing flew through the night in complete silence. It covered 32 yards in less than half a second, and it struck the German gunner directly in the left eye socket, penetrating through to the brainstem. The gunner's head snapped back. He collapsed. No scream, no sound, just gone. The ammunition loader looked over. Heinrich? Heinrich? Was this Los? He leaned over to check on his partner. That's when Jack's second shot hit him in the temple. He dropped across the machine gun. The officer saw both men fall. He started to turn, reaching for his pistol, his mouth opening to shout an alarm. Jack's third shot hit him in the throat, crushing his windpipe. The officer clutched his neck, trying to scream, but only a horrible gurgling sound came out. He fell backwards into the sandbags. 3 shots. 3 seconds. 3 dead German soldiers. Position 1 was neutralized, and nobody had heard a thing. Jack didn't celebrate. He reloaded 3 fresh ball bearings into his pouch. He backed slowly out of the drainage ditch, and he disappeared into the darkness like a ghost. When the German relief crew arrived at Position 1 at 0600 hours to rotate the guards, they found 3 dead soldiers and no indication of what had killed them. No bullet wounds, no shrapnel, no sign of American activity anywhere near the position. Just 3 men with catastrophic head trauma that looked like they'd been struck by something moving at impossible velocity. The German commander sent an urgent report back to headquarters. Position 1 compromised. Cause unknown. Suspected new American weapon. Here's where things got interesting because the German forces weren't stupid. They knew something had happened. They just couldn't figure out what. On the morning of December 23rd, German intelligence officers examined the bodies from Position 1. They found the entry wounds perfectly circular, 3/4 of an inch in diameter. But there were no bullets, no shrapnel, no explosive residue. One officer theorized it was a new type of American sniper round that completely vaporized after impact. Another thought it might be some experimental weapon. A third officer, a veteran of the Eastern Front, suggested it might be Soviet special forces using suppressed pistols, somehow operating behind German lines. None of them even considered a slingshot. Why would they? Slingshots were children's toys. The idea that a soldier would use one in modern combat was absurd. So they did what any military force would do when facing an unknown threat. They doubled the guards at the remaining 6 positions. Each machine gun nest now had 6 soldiers instead of 3. They installed additional sandbags. They reduced the size of the viewing slits. They set up trip wires and early warning systems. And Jack Thornton, watching all of this through his binoculars from 800 yards away, smiled. Because they'd just made his job easier. More soldiers in a confined space meant more targets. Smaller viewing slits meant the gunners would have to lean closer to see out. And trip wires? Trip wires were useless against a weapon that struck from 30 yards away. That night, December 23rd at 2200 hours, Jack went hunting again. Position 2 was different from Position 1. The Germans had learned. This position was set back further from the tree line, 48 yards instead of 35. The viewing slit was smaller, and there were now 6 soldiers crammed into a space designed for 3. Jack spent 2 hours getting into position. This time he couldn't use the drainage ditch. It didn't extend far enough. Instead, he had to crawl across open ground, moving inch by inch through the snow. By the time he reached his firing position, his hands were numb and his entire body was shaking from the cold. He was 38 yards away, at the outer edge of his effective range. And with 6 targets instead of 3, this was going to be more complex. He watched. He waited. He studied their patrol patterns. The Germans rotated positions every 12 minutes. When one soldier stepped away from the gun to warm his hands, another immediately took his place. They were being careful, professional. At 0015 hours, Jack saw his opportunity. During the rotation, for exactly 8 seconds, 3 soldiers were clustered together on the left side of the position while the other 3 were on the right. A gap of about 4 feet separated the 2 groups. Jack fired 6 shots in 11 seconds. The first 3 dropped the left group before anyone even realized what was happening. The sound of bodies falling made the right group turn. That's when shots 4 and 5 took out the next 2 soldiers. The last German soldier actually saw Jack, saw the silhouette in white camouflage in the darkness, saw the Y-shaped object in his hands. He was raising his rifle when Jack's 6th shot struck him in the forehead. Position 2 was down. 6 soldiers eliminated. Total time from first shot to last shot, 11 seconds. But here's where Jack made a decision that would become legendary. He didn't retreat. He looked at his map. Position 3 was only 220 yards from Position 2, and with the adrenaline of combat still coursing through his veins, with his hands finally warmed up from the shooting, with his mind in that perfect state of focus that hunters call the zone, he decided to hit Position 3 the same night. 2 positions in one night. Nobody had asked him to do this. Nobody expected it. But Jack had realized something. Every hour these machine gun nests stayed operational, more American soldiers died. And he wasn't going to let that happen if he could prevent it. He reached position 3 at 0205 hours. This one was easier. The German soldiers had heard nothing from position 2 because there was nothing to hear, so they had no idea they were in danger. Jack eliminated all 6 soldiers in 15 seconds from 35 yards away. When Jack crawled back through American lines at 0430 hours on December 24th, Sergeant Morrison was waiting for him. Morrison looked at Jack's empty ammunition pouch, looked at his frost-covered face and said, "How many?" Jack, his voice hoarse from the cold, replied, 2 positions, 12 enemy Kia, 0 American casualties. Morrison just stared at him. Then he said, "You magnificent crazy dude." By the morning of December 24th, the German command was in chaos. 3 machine gun positions had been eliminated in less than 24 hours. 18 soldiers dead. And nobody had any idea how it was happening. The Americans hadn't fired a single shot. There had been no artillery, no mortars, no airstrikes, no commando raids. The soldiers were just dying, silently, mysteriously, like they were being picked off by an invisible force. German intelligence now had multiple theories. Some officers believed the Americans had deployed a new silent weapon, perhaps compressed air rifles or experimental dart guns. Others thought it was partisan fighters from the Belgian resistance. One paranoid officer even suggested it might be a werewolf, a piece of Germanic folklore about supernatural soldiers. The German commander, Oberst Klaus Richter, didn't believe in werewolves, but he did believe in fear, and fear was spreading through his remaining positions like a virus. Soldiers were refusing to take positions near the viewing slits. Some were demanding to be reassigned. One soldier had to be physically forced at gunpoint to take his position on the machine gun. Richter made a decision. He pulled back the remaining 4 machine gun positions by 200 yards. He tripled the guards again, now 18 soldiers per position. He installed spotlights. He sent out patrol squads to sweep the area every 2 hours. And he personally visited each position to tell his soldiers that any man who abandoned his post would be shot for cowardice. But here's what Richter didn't understand. Jack Thornton wasn't afraid of spotlights. He wasn't afraid of patrols. And he certainly wasn't afraid of Germans who were now bunched together in groups of 18, making themselves even bigger targets. On Christmas Eve, while German soldiers huddled in their fortified positions, terrified of the invisible killer stalking them, Jack Thornton was cleaning his slingshot and preparing for the final push. 4 positions left. 72 soldiers standing between the Americans and a breakthrough. He had 48 hours left on his self-imposed deadline, and he had never felt more focused in his entire life. Christmas Day, 1944. While soldiers on both sides typically observed an unofficial truce during the holidays, this Christmas was different. The Battle of the Bulge was reaching its critical phase. There would be no truce, no peace, just war. Jack hit position 4 at dawn, 0530 hours. With 18 soldiers crammed into one machine gun nest, it took him 43 seconds to eliminate all of them. He used a different tactic this time. Instead of going for headshots, he targeted center mass. Chest shots, heart and lung shots. The ball bearings punched through ribs like they weren't even there. 18 shots, 18 hits, 18 German soldiers down. Position 5 went down at 1,400 hours. 20 soldiers this time. The Germans had reinforced it even further. Jack approached from a different angle using a destroyed farmhouse as cover. He was 42 yards away, at the absolute edge of his range. He missed his first shot in the entire operation. The ball bearing struck a sandbag instead of its target. But the next 23 shots were perfect. 23 soldiers eliminated. By this point, the German forces knew they were under attack by something, but they still couldn't figure out what. They'd found some of the ball bearings in the bodies. One German medical officer examined them and concluded they'd been fired from an unknown American projectile weapon of considerable power. Positions 6 and 7 were the hardest. The Germans had positioned them side by side, with overlapping fields of view. 30 soldiers in each position. 60 soldiers total. They'd installed spotlights that swept the approach routes every 30 seconds. They'd dug deeper trenches. And they'd positioned snipers in the trees behind the positions specifically to watch for any American approach. Jack studied these positions for 6 hours. He calculated angles. He timed the spotlights. He watched the sniper patterns. And then, at 2,100 hours on Christmas night, he made his move. He didn't approach from the front. He didn't approach from the sides. He climbed a tree 400 yards behind the German positions and spent 2 hours slowly, silently, moving from tree to tree through the canopy until he was directly above and behind positions 6 and 7. The German snipers were watching for threats coming from the American lines. They never thought to look up. From his elevated position 40 feet in the air, Jack had a perfect angle down into both machine gun nests. The sandbags that protected the soldiers from frontal fire meant nothing. From above, they were completely exposed. At 2,315 hours, Jack began firing. He systematically worked through position 6, then position 7. 60 soldiers. 63 shots fired, he missed twice. His fingers were numb from gripping the tree branches. 60 soldiers down. At 2,348 hours on December 25, 1944, Jack Thornton climbed down from that tree and walked back to American lines. He was exhausted. His hands were bleeding from the surgical tubing. His shoulders ached from the constant draw weight. He'd been awake for 72 hours straight. He'd fired 142 shots. He'd hit 140 times. He'd eliminated 126 German soldiers. And he'd neutralized all 7 machine gun positions. When he stumbled into the American trench, Sergeant Morrison caught him before he collapsed. Morrison looked at him and said, "All 7." Jack nodded. Morrison started laughing, then crying, then laughing again. He called out to the entire battalion, "Thornton did it! All 7 positions are down." The kid with the slingshot took out all 7 positions. The entire trench erupted in cheers. Soldiers who'd mocked Jack 3 days earlier were slapping him on the back, hugging him, calling him a legend. Colonel Roberts himself came down from the command post, looked at Jack and said simply, "Thank you, Private. You just saved this battalion." On December 26, 1944, the 101st Airborne launched their counteroffensive. Without the 7 machine gun positions to suppress American movement, the attack was devastating. The German forces, already demoralized and confused by the mysterious deaths of over 120 soldiers, broke and retreated. The siege of Bastogne was effectively over. Jack Thornton was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor. His official citation read, "For extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against an armed enemy." But the citation didn't mention a slingshot. Military command decided that would sound too ridiculous in the official record. They classified it as specialized equipment and left it at that. But here's the thing about soldiers. They talk. They share stories. And within weeks, every soldier in the European theater had heard about Rabbit Thornton and his slingshot. The story spread to the Pacific Theater. It reached training camps back in the States. And it became one of those legends that soldiers tell each other, the kind of story that seems too crazy to be true but absolutely is. Jack survived the war. He returned to Harlan County, Kentucky in 1946. He never talked about what happened in the Ardennes. When reporters tried to interview him about the Slingshot incident, he politely declined. He went back to hunting in the mountains. He married his childhood sweetheart. He lived to age 89. But here's the final twist to the story. In 1997, a researcher at the Army War College was reviewing classified after-action reports from the Battle of the Bulge. She found a German intelligence document dated December 26, 1944. It was Oberst Klaus Richter's final report before his forces retreated. The report included a list of theories about what new American weapon had been responsible for eliminating the 7 machine gun positions. Buried at the bottom of the list, marked with a notation that translates to absurd but cannot be ruled out, was this entry: possible use of primitive projectile weapon sling or similar device. Recommend investigation. They knew. The Germans actually figured it out. But it sounded so ridiculous, so impossible, so completely insane that they buried it in the report and never followed up. Because who would believe that in the middle of World War II, in the greatest mechanized conflict in human history, with tanks and aircraft and artillery and machine guns, one American soldier with a slingshot and a pouch full of ball bearings had single-handedly eliminated 126 enemy combatants and changed the course of a battle. But that's exactly what happened. And when people mocked Jack Thornton for bringing a slingshot to a gunfight, he proved something that every great warrior throughout history has known. It's not about the weapon. It's about the warrior. Jack Rabbit Thornton, Private 101st Airborne Division. The man who won a battle with a slingshot. And they never laughed at him again.